All right, welcome back to the channel. So Bernard Hopkins says that Errol Spence Jr. is just clout chasing Canelo Alvarez and that Canelo Alvarez would gladly take a fight with him, but he didn't know that Canelo already turned down the fight. But let's talk about what Bernard Hopkins had to say about Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So Bernard Hopkins gave an interview to Fight Hub and Marcos Villegas. Very, very good interview. I think it was released in parts. Not quite sure when exactly this interview was given. Might have been, I'm hoping, before Canelo Alvarez said that he didn't want to fight Errol Spence Jr. Because when Marcos Villegas asked Bernard Hopkins what he thinks about Errol Spence Jr. wanting a fight with Canelo, Bernard Hopkins' response was that he is sure Canelo Alvarez would hop right on that and take that money, easy money, because Errol Spence Jr. is too small, and has not had enough time to adjust to that weight class. Now, when Bernard Hopkins says that he will believe it when he sees it about Errol Spence Jr. fighting Canelo, he looked at it from the point of view of Errol Spence Jr. and said, hey, there's a lot of guys that want to be part of the conversation about Canelo. I saw how Errol went to the fight and said that he wanted to have the fight. He wanted to fight Canelo. And Bernard pretty much just didn't take him seriously and said, nah, ain't no way I'll believe it when I see it. But it was based on the premise that Canelo wouldn't have any problem, or at least he assumed that Canelo wouldn't have any problem doing the fight. And the reason that he said it was, again, that Canelo is too big, too strong, like you hear a lot of people say. Like I said, again, every time I hear the conversation come up about this fight with Errol Spence Jr., I constantly hear about how Canelo Alvarez is too big, right? Now, Bernard Hopkins says the same thing, but he says that Canelo will take the fight. And why would he say that? Because obviously it's a huge fight. That's what Marcos Villegas said. He's like, that would be a gigantic fight. It is. It's literally the biggest fight in boxing. Right? It's not just a big fight. It's potentially the biggest fight in boxing when you consider that stadium, they can get about $18 million worth of ticket sales out of that stadium in Dallas, Texas. And the pay-per-view on that fight would be gigantic, bigger than anything Canelo Alvarez is doing or has probably ever done other than Floyd Mayweather Jr. It's a really big fight. So why, if Bernard Hopkins says, oh yeah, I'm sure Canelo would hop right on that, why isn't Canelo hopping right on it? It makes obvious sense that fight, that should be the case, right? But no, it's not. They turned it down. Now, this is what I think, and I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. Canelo Alvarez, in the best scenario, has a couple more fights to go on his DAZN deal. And they negotiated a way to get Oscar De La Hoya out of the middle of Canelo Alvarez's relationship with DAZN. And that Canelo, in exchange for continuing to fight on, carries on with a plan that DAZN has, where he fights guys like Callum Smith, and then Yaldemir, and then Gennady Golovkin. And then they have done the great amount of money that they wanted to do. They got what they wanted out of it. And then Canelo Alvarez is free to go and do whatever he wants to do, right? Now, that is what and I've said this before, for everybody that thinks I'm just this big Canelo Alvarez hater. I do not hate on Canelo Alvarez. I will say he tested positive for Combuterol because he did. And I will say that Callum Smith doesn't have any chance to beat this guy because he didn't. And that's just a fact. That's not hating. I'm going to say this if he fights Yaldemir too. It's a bunk fight. Don't want to see it. The guy doesn't have a chance. That's just a fact. Okay? I'm a little bit intrigued about Billy Joe Saunders, because I was like, you know what? Billy Billy Joe Saunders is actually fairly mobile, but I don't know. I still think Canelo's going to get him. But hey, that may have some type of interest because Billy Joe Saunders at least is not a robot. Okay, he's going to move around. He's going to be able to give some different looks to Canelo Alvarez. We'll see what happens if that fight happens, right? But what I know for sure is that Canelo Alvarez is not going to be fighting Demetrius Andrade. He's not going to be fighting Jermall Charlo, and he's not going to be fighting Errol Spence Jr. And the excuses not by Canelo. I'm hoping that he's just getting out of this DAZN contract and then he'll be free to fight a real fight. But people acting like Callum Smith was a real fight. Did you hear what James Toney had to say about the Callum Smith fight when Ellie Sathback was like, oh, yeah, that was a good fight. I mean, Callum Smith was a good fighter. James Toney said, man, that guy was scared half to death. He looked up, he's like, what? That guy was scared half to death in that ring. Exactly. Come on, man. And James Toney's like, man, come on. There are people who will fight Canelo Alvarez that are not scared to death, okay? Just the oversell of this nonsense. So that's what I'm hoping the case is. But if it's not the case, and even if it is the case, when people say that Errol Spence Jr. should not be asking for this fight, it flies in the face of logic in a couple ways, right? Number one, everybody keeps saying that that's the biggest fight of boxing, that the biggest fights are what people need to make. Oh, we're just looking for the biggest fights. We're looking for the biggest money, right? If you listen to Bob Arum talk about Errol Spence Jr. when he's talking about the Terrence Crawford fight, they're acting like maybe they'll make a couple pennies in that fight. Yet it's the only fight that really is out there for Terrence Crawford. I mean, for Errol Spence. And yet maybe they'll make a little money. How is it possible for Errol Spence to ever make a lot of money if he will barely make some money against Terrence Crawford, right? Like, it's just so obvious that they just say whatever they need to do to make the headlines be what they want the headlines to be, and there's really not any seriousness about this, okay? Everybody knows, anybody that has taken basic arithmetic knows, basic arithmetic and, maybe accounting 101, know that the biggest fight is Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez. And anybody that watch boxing knows that that's what people keep saying they want all the time. But right here in the middle of this, they try to find a way to say why the fight's not taking place, but without saying what most likely the biggest reason is. And the biggest reason would be that DAZN doesn't want that fight. The DAZN wants to get Canelo all the way through what he's going to get through. They're going to take the name of Canelo and they're going to go sell the name of Canelo to try to go get some global subscribers out there in Czechoslovakia or wherever the heck they're trying to get them from. Because they're not trying to get him from the United States, and they just had their global launching, right? We got a global launching. Man, you know what that global launching reminds me of DAZN? If you ever seen The Office, the show The Office, there's this character who became the vice president. Vice president got elevated to vice president and then created a website. And then that website wound up being this janky thing. But anyway, man, it's like at this point in time, let's just get real with it. If Canelo Alvarez is not going to fight somebody like Jermall Charlo or Canelo or Errol Spence Jr., just stop calling the dude number one. Just treat number one pound for pound what it is. It's the number one pound for pound exactly for ring, because that's who they want to be the number one pound for pound. ESPN wants their fighter to be the number one pound for pound. So Terrence Crawford is the number one pound for pound, right? You want the networks want their fighters fighting on their network. So those are the fighters that they're going to fight. And if the two can't fight, then they're going to always blame the other guy. And ESPN is doing it blatantly. DAZN is doing it blatantly. And it's just silly, man. But anyway, it is what it is. You let me know what you think in the comments section. And with that, I'm out. Peace, and follow me on Instagram for non-fantasy fights. Peace.